Hi class, welcome back to Writing 201. Today we're going to focus on pace. Pace is something that is practiced in all levels of writing and is included in all levels of writing. And I could teach you the basics of pace, but because this is an intermediate class, I'm going to focus on the intermediate level of pace. Now, Class 101 is welcome to join in and listen, but keep in mind that I will not be slowing down and there will not be a certain, Neanderthal way of explaining things, not to diminish your writing, but more in the sense of I'm going to explain the richness that comes with years of practice trying to smooth out your pacing and learning how to play with different energies in pace, starting with the theater of it all. Make sure you pause if you have to. Theater of it all essentially means how you move your characters around as if they were independent puppets. A puppeteer can just do this, with the strings and everything, but that still gives the illusion of control. When you're writing a scene, there's a bit of flexibility in terms of how you give your character independence, in terms of their thought process, decision making, how they interact with other characters, how the world itself interacts with them, that kind of thing. So when I say the theater of it all, I mean there's supposed to be some kind of sense of dramaticism in terms of when your characters are not only interacting with each other, but how you emphasize how a scene unfolds in fiction, whereas in reality it wouldn't be as, entertaining or captivating. It would be very matter of fact, and yes, there would still be complexities depending on the situation. But in fiction, you're sort of focusing on the more interesting parts of what would be deemed a real moment. So the theatrical part of it is essentially keeping your reader's attention in terms of the entertainment factor. You're not just doing dialogue as if it was a business meeting. There's some kind of actor choice. Does that make sense? That the character is not just saying verbatim what they think. There's some kind of inner monologue, and even if it's not written down, you still have that ability to, kind of show the undertone, the subtext. So, unlike theater, the theater of it all in fiction is that it's only on paper. So that's why it can be a bit complicated at first, because you have to be able to say what's happening in terms of the reality layer, but also adding the layer of dramaticism that intensifies, and I don't mean by the level of intensity, but intensify the theater to reality ratio. Does that make sense? If not, just let me go. Let me know in the comments. Okay. Next, chemistry for characters and the world. So, what that means for pace, for the chemistry between characters and chemistry in the world and with your characters, is how do you create not just an evolution in between characters and the world itself, but how do you create the ebb and flow in those changes? So the way to do that for pacing is to understand that whichever character you decide to focus on, and whatever is the focal point of each chapter or scene, you're able to transition from one point of view to another. And to be able to do that, you have to have enough practice and enough understanding of multiple ways of doing pace. So that's why reading is very important for pace, because not every author is going to do pacing in the same way. So please, when you work on your pacing, understand it's not just about what I'm telling you, but your own voracious reading. You have to read so many different books in order to understand pace, because everyone has a different understanding of what pace means. And I don't mean like one person understands it as very chaotic, the other person as slow. It's more like that person's understanding of chaos and that person's understanding of chaos could be different. So once you see how they do it, then you just understand how they do pace, and then do your own version and understanding of pace. So how that ties back in to chemistry is your choice of how you decide to do the exchange between characters that creates a certain forward motion, not in terms of that character's development, but the story itself. So you could have a character be very static, and especially in conversation, but it is that character that is static. So that's when you start to think, well, how can I break that static? How can I encourage them to break out of their static? And that's the characters that they interact with. And let's say they have no other characters to interact with, or it just doesn't do anything. Then you start thinking about, how can I force them to have limited options? And that's where the chemistry between them and the world that you created creates an opportunity to not just break the monotony, but also create a more advanced pace. So pace doesn't really mean the speed and fluidity of your story. It also means how you include all your components to play this song and dance that is called a story. So it's not really just about understanding how to pick up the pace or slow down the pace. It's also about the theatrics and how the chemistry, like, I know I'm repeating myself here, but they all tie together, is what I'm trying to say. So specifically about chemistry, there has to be some kind of unison in all components of your story. So not just your character development, your world building, but also emotional acreage, how you write fantasy or the genre that you chose to, how background elements work, and geography, all this stuff. So that's why chemistry is really important to understand. Okay? Next, probably the most nerve-wracking one, because I just started working on it, POV pivots. So POV, or point of view, I'm not really talking about first person, second person, more like whichever character or even creature you decide to put on the focal front of whichever part of the story that you're in. If you decide to pivot from creature or person to person or person to environment, then you have to see how do you transition from that focal point to the next. Because you can't just jump from one end to the other. You have to find some way of essentially writing the same scene or stay in the same area, but have different focal points that kind of revolve around the same objective of that scene. So say your character is walking in the forest and you want to stay in that forest for at least 2 more chapters, but you don't want to bore the reader, especially if the pace feels the same, and that we're only seeing one person. Now that could work. You could do the same character for several chapters, but for the book I'm working on now, Black Rose Cocoon, in which I have a 4-character rotation, there has to be some sense of pivot point in the same environment that shows different areas of that environment without jumping too much in terms of what you're talking about and where we are in the story. So say there's some animals in there, and you don't want to have just an animal chase in every single chapter, every single scene, because when it comes to nature, it is so lively and so unpredictable, and there's no rules there in terms of the animal kingdom, that how you decide to put your characters in peril, it can be fun. You can really diversify it. So that's what I mean by, when it comes to pace, pivot points in point of view allow you to stay in the same scene without boring your reader. And it's not that you have to do this crazy topsy-turvy circle. It's more like you ask yourself, is this perspective, this path that I'm putting this character on, good enough for having a stopping point, and then go like this and stay in the same area with another character, or we go to a house as a focal point and then revert back to that character, however you want to do it. But that's basically what POV pivot means. Okay? Next up, balance of liveliness and stillness. So when I say liveliness and stillness, to pace the molecular activity in your scene, you have to see, when do I increase the heat and activity in the scene, and when is it time for a breather for the reader. Breathers are really important, because if you just have go with your action, the reader can't keep up. And even if they can, they're not going to learn anything. I know not everyone likes to learn when they're reading, but what I mean by learning is that if you have no pause in the high molecular activity, then the reader doesn't have a chance to digest what they just read, especially if it's an action scene. So by having that little bit of a breather, there's that opportunity to give a human moment to any character, even an antagonist, especially an antagonist. If an antagonist was drawn as a freaking cartoon in terms of their action, it would just be like, oh my god, stop it, that's so annoying. So don't do that. Okay, so when it comes to pace, liveliness and stillness, essentially that's you deciding how hyper do I want to make my reader, and how mellow do I want them to be. And when they're in those moments of highs and lows, what are they thinking about? What do I want them to think about? Do I want to do the thinking for them, or do I want to create this sort of up and down pace that creates this sort of spiciness and sweetness, where you have this very articulate and hot moment in the story, and then you're like, you know what, I gotta wash this down with something good. And it doesn't mean something happy-go-lucky. Stillness doesn't mean, okay, I've damaged the character enough, I'll give them a break. No, that's not what stillness means. Stillness is essentially the stopping point of the story's what's the word here? Visceral energy, where it's such a punch in the face and punch in the gut that you kind of need to stand there for a second. You know, like if you're a fighter, you know that if you get a good hit, you have to have the ability to and then carry on. That's essentially what liveliness and stillness is in terms of creating that balance and pace. Okay? I'm nodding to myself. Oh yeah, that was good. That was good, man. Okay. Last but not least, probably the most important and fun to me in pace is the 5 senses. For character, world, and reader. So what does that mean? It essentially means you have to, over time, learn how to incorporate the 5 senses, not just for the characters, but how the reader reacts to all those senses that you're including. Okay? Now, before I continue, okay, have a listen to this soundbite. Okay, so in that soundbite, all I did was walk around the house and then go down the stairs. That's it. Because what I wanted to show you, or have you listen to, is just the idea of how the simplicity of 0 distraction and 1 sound can keep your attention. So that's what I mean by the value of making your 5 senses visceral. Because as human beings, we tend to take our senses for granted, especially if we have all of them. When we see a deaf person or a blind person, we just think, oh, that sucks. But they live on. They live their life as if it's normal, because just they have a limitation, but it doesn't mean that they don't continue on living. But that's beside the point. The point I'm trying to make here is that when it comes to pace, the senses will allow the reader to feel everything in the scene. Because by maximizing how, not just how the senses are working for the characters and the world, but how the reader can actually kind of mimic all of those in their head and feel them. And even though it's just text, if you can do that, if you can make a scene feel like it's playing in their head and it feels absolutely real to them, that is how you know you've mastered the 5 senses. And that is why it's the last point I'm making here, because it is the most important. Because all the other things that I mentioned, that's all opinion to me. But 5 senses, to me, should be a universal understanding of pace. Because to be able to make a sound like popping popcorn, induce a certain memory in a reader's memory is powerful, because that means that if it somehow connects to their brain and all the way back in their memory where they remember going to a carnival and remember the smells and the sound of popcorn popping and the butter being drizzled on, or even caramel, and maybe they like to mix chocolate in there, if you make these delectable things in terms of the senses, that's what makes a reader really like the story, because you use the senses to connect with them, connect with their feelings and their memory and the emotions that they can attach to that. That is how you get a reader to care about your story in terms of the pacing that you create. So really remember that. Remember the value of being a human being, especially if you have all of your senses. Okay? So, in summary, pace is something that I admittedly am always working on, because when I was writing Boone and Jacques, I had real trouble with pacing. And yes, they got awards and I'm grateful for them, but I really used that series as a practice for pacing, because all the other things I knew I was eventually going to have a good grasp on it, but pacing I knew was something that only becomes natural over time, and with a lot more reading and diversifying, and diversifying what you read, but also how you grow up, what you go through in life. And really pacing, metaphorically speaking and philosophically, is really tied to life, because the pace your life goes through is so random. Some people think that they can plan everything, and if they have the money, they can live their life very accordingly, and that nothing can change it. But life doesn't work that way, okay? Life doesn't work that way. You have to understand something here. How the pace works in your life is what creates diversity in your writing. Because when you see the life experience that you gain and the people involved in those experiences, it really shows you that you can pull so much from life. That includes how you pick and choose what kind of pace for every book you work on. And even if you were to write just one book or one series for your writing career, it's still there. It still has a purpose. Your life, I mean, in terms of how you connect it to writing. So that's that. I hope that this class was of great value to you. It was to me. I'm not sure how long it'll be before I do the next video, because I'm in the home stretch of the first draft of Black Rose Cocoon. So, till next time, happy reading, have a good day, and thank you for participating. Alright.